This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist William Kentridge. The world-renowned Kentridge is a multifaceted artist whose work includes prints, drawings, animations, sculptures, and design collaborations for the stage. He took time out to speak from his home's garden studio in Johannesburg, South Africa, about his creative process, the value of ambiguity, the importance of place, and his latest show, opening September 12th at Marian Goodman Gallery in New York. And now, a conversation about uncertainty, time, and fate with artist William Kentridge. Kentridge, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. William, I wanted to have you on to speak about a new show you have coming up, Oh, to Believe in Another World, that runs from September 12th to October 21st at Marian Goodman Gallery. But normally with artists, I like to start with a hypothetical, and that is, say you're sitting at a dinner party and for some reason the person you've been sat next to has no idea who William Kentridge is. Where do you start to explain your work and what it consists of?
Well, it always sounds very tendentious because they say, what are you? What do you do? You say, well, I'm an artist. That's already an embarrassment these days to say I'm an artist, like saying I'm unemployed, and unemployable, more to the point. And then it is, oh, what sort of things do you do? So, well, I make drawings. I say, okay. And they think, oh, technical drawings, is this an engineer? And they say, no, I make animations. And they say, oh, he makes comics. Okay. And then he said, and also sculpture, that's starting to get too many things. And he said, also direct theater or opera. Then it's like, no, this is like an Amateursville, doing everything, able to do nothing, get a job. But all of those things are part of what happens in the studio and what gets made.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it's just people want to put people in a box, right? And there's no one box that kind of can contain all of the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, when I was much younger, when I was starting out, I had very good advice from people who said, you can't do theater and drawing and filmmaking. Choose one of them and try to master it, become good at drawing, become good at theater. Which seemed very sage advice. So I tried to take it and I stopped drawing. I sold my etching press. I thought, okay, I'll try to be an actor. But fortunately, I failed at that. And I failed to write film scripts that anyone was interested in. So I ended up back being an artist again. And for some years, I tried to stick just to that limited discipline. But after a while, I discovered I was starting to make films, animated films, and then those were going into theater. And eventually I understood that the only hope for the work was what happened from all the additions, from all the new thoughts that came from working across disciplines rather than in one discipline. And that the drawing was richer for what came to it from the theater, and the theater was only interesting because of what the drawings brought into the performance. And so by now I've given up trying to, even at the beginning of a project, decide what it will necessarily be.
I've heard you say before that you quit that initial push of being an artist. You quit because you felt like you had nothing to say, but that doesn't sound anything like the William Kentridge we know today. I mean, what changed?
I think what changed was when I started, this is South Africa in the 1970s, a very heated political circumstance. I was very aware of what it was to be a white, privileged young man in that society. And you had to justify who you were in a way. And so that for a while, the art I was making in the theater projects I was doing very much designed with what are the images that are needed, what are the lessons that can be taught to the world. So it was a kind of a Leninist view. What is to be done? What are the images to be made? And I came back to being an artist when I discovered that I had no idea what the images were that had to be made, what lessons I could teach the world. And that I had to not think on behalf of an audience, but say, if the work interests me, and people I'm working with, then that's enough, and that will be how it proceeds.
That reminds me of how you've described your process as having this sort of disassociative duality, that there's the artist as creator that needs to be intuitive and impulsive, but there's also artist as critic that kind of begs for revision and searches for meaning.
Yeah.
And I feel some artists have problems because they're asking that critic to be the creator. I mean, they want all the problems kind of solved before they begin work, but that isn't necessarily the best course of action, is it?
I think it's important to try to keep the critic in check and at a distance. And that I've always felt for the studio to operate, it needs to be a safe space for stupidity, for not knowing what you're doing, for giving an impulse or an image the benefit of the doubt. And then in due course, you can interrogate it to see if it earns its keep, if it justifies its place to continue. But to work it out in advance always means that the artist has to be smarter than what he or she is making. And I think the artwork always needs to be smarter than the person making it. Otherwise, you shouldn't be doing it. There's something you need to learn or discover in the process of making, rather than simply giving a set of instructions to the piece of paper when you know in advance what it's going to be. And that conversation of knowing or not knowing, guiding but receiving, is a vital part, whether it's a drawing or whether it's a performance, even whether it's writing a script.
So in a way, it's kind of a need to access the subconscious, that maybe our best ideas are just beyond our grasp.
I think it's vital that I mean, I think just in my case, if I think of all the things that have been seen by other people as good ideas in the work, none of them had come with me thinking they were good ideas. There were things that had come inadvertently through the work, which I thought were mistakes. I apologized for, and it had to be pointed out to me what it was, in fact, that I was doing. To give an example for people to understand, the drawings I make with charcoal get erased and redrawn. And it's never possible to get a perfect erasure. There's always a gray trace of the previous state of a drawing. So that as a movement on a sheet of paper continues, there's a ghostly trace of all the different iterations of that drawing, the different frames of the film. And at first, I tried very hard to do my most conscientious erasure. And I kept on apologizing, saying, I'm sorry that the erasure is imperfect. The next film I make, it'll get it better. And I tried many different materials. And eventually one of my friends said, stop complaining. In fact, the erasures are the one part of the drawing that's interesting. And then I suddenly stopped and looked at it again and said, oh, okay, you're right. Yes, let's keep the trace. And in fact, then that gave rise to a whole series of different thematic elements in them, questions of making time concrete, of allowing memory to continue and be visible. But it wasn't something I'd had as a good idea and think, how do I show time passing? This is a good idea. This is what was happening in the drawing, and that's what it provoked. So I'm not sure if that's an unconscious understanding of it, or it's an openness to recognize what comes towards you. And there are many examples in the same sphere.
You know, for that to work, you can't consider any mark too sacred, right? I mean, I think some artists, as they're working, they particularly feel that some part of the painting is working and they don't want to change it. But, for that, I've heard you refer to it as needing to maintain an openness to recognize things as they happen.
Yeah. I mean, there does need to be an openness to say, yes, the drawing's looking fine now, but it's got to continue. Its work is not done. Or sometimes if there's a drawing which I said, oh, that's a surprising, interesting drawing to arrived here. Sometimes I'll stop that sequence there, say that's where that sequence ends. And as it were, in filmic terms, we'll cut to a close-up, we'll cut to a different angle, to another drawing. So it's not quite as pure as saying, oh, nothing will ever happen to the drawings as we go. I mean, they'll all be, and it is a problem. One knows that you start drawing quickly, and if you start really well, there's a temptation to slow down and not mess up what you've done. And so to keep the same pace and tempo of drawing is a task, and the animation makes that easier. You have to work at speed, otherwise the animation never happens. You spend too long on each frame. And you've got to trust, or I have to trust that provisionality and speed and lightness of work will still be coherent when the film is projected.
I think most people, when they think of your work, they think of it in terms of black and white. That your most recent body of work, there is a fair amount of color. But is the choice to work within that noir, is that a matter of being attracted to light and dark, shadow and form? Or, is part of it the fact that, as you're just saying, the necessity to work fast, it was helpful to work with one color?
No, I think the work with charcoal long preceded the work in animation. I think I was just a very incompetent painter in oil paint, which is how students started in South Africa in the 1970s. It never felt a comfortable medium. It was always saying, does this look nice? Does this look good? Which is a terrible question for an artist to be asking. It has to be a series of other questions, and the drawing takes its chances. You discover how it looks at the end. I mean, I think in terms of images, they always had a strong affinity to graphic works, to etchings, to lithographs, which by nature are, in essence, are monochromatic, black and white, come out of printing world, of text, of things like that. And then out of black and white photography. So I suppose a lot of the images I was looking at had their origins and had connections to that kind of world. But also, I suppose, later on when I was doing animation, there's a kind of you're dealing with tone, so you're not thinking, I've got to change this piece completely because I'm moving from the red table to the green floor. You're moving from a darker gray to a lighter gray. It's a very different alteration. So it definitely does have to do with it, with the practicalities of the medium, of the grammar of the medium. You always have to be working within what do you bring to the drawing, and how does the world meet the drawing halfway? And so things that are monochromatic, whether they're black and white photographs or black objects that have that space in the world, are already coming towards you as a half-formed drawing.
So I know you're a collector of words, ideas, phrases, and those words and phrases will often find their way into your work. Does the creator or the critic add that text? I mean, are you drawing inspiration?
It works both ways. It works when reading, particularly when reading poetry, but also all reading or different texts connected to a subject I'm working on. I very much read with a pencil, marking phrases, sentences, or paragraphs. And then when the book or collection of poems is done, I will go back through and transcribe those different phrases. So then I have a book which would say Words 2023. And then when I'm working on a project, I'll go through those and I'll mark the ones that I'm interested in as I read through them quickly and type those out. Have those on the table literally as 100 or 200 little scraps of paper, and then start arranging them, not randomly, but seeing what phrases seem to talk to each other. So, it may be a phrase of Aeschylus that meets a phrase of Bertolt Brecht that meets a piece of Szymborska in translation. And those three lines make a phrase. So it's neither random nor is it planned. It's in the space in between, where you rely on, so they're not randomly chosen. They're not chosen for a rational reason. But cumulatively, they reflect, I suppose, concerns, desires, fears that one has. And I'm not a writer. I'm not a writer of fiction. I'm not a writer of dialogue. So all the theater projects that I make need an assembly of text for the libretto. And those are by and large done from found fragments. Sometimes longer texts, a long letter, but generally a line here, a line there, a phrase, two lines together. And the current project which we're working on, which is a theater project about a ship's journey from Marseille to Martinique in 1941, uses poets of the era and Bertolt Brecht and others. And while constructing it, in fact, we have a long series of footnotes so I can kind of remember and track where the different fragments have come from. But in earlier projects, those were just taken out of the book, and some I remember and some I don't. But all the good lines aren't written by me. There are a lot of filler lines I do write, but they're never the best ones.
But those pieces, I had a guest recently that was talking about William S. Burroughs and cut up text and repiecing things back together. And, in particular, I'm thinking of like your Sybil project, those pieces that you brought together from all of these disparate sources.
Yeah.
It becomes its own form of poetry in the end.
I suppose it does, being generous. It does become a text. The text combined with the music for the Sybil became a very strong component. I think if we just read the text, there'd be all these fragments. If we just had the music without the words, the two somehow work together very strongly. Trying a similar thing in the current theatre project. And some parts I'm sure will work well. Other parts, I suspect the number of words will shrink and shrink and shrink from what's assembled at the moment. The 50 pages now will become 40 pages, which may end up as 20 pages when performed. And there's a process of both working on the text, going through it again, rearranging, taking out, finding new fragments that go in, and working on the images that are going to be projected of life on the ship at the same time. And then, when I can, working with the composer and the musicians on different fragments which affect how the texts work. So it does become a stirring of the pot. So it needs an openness on all sides to not, the images which have emerged, and I've no idea quite how they will fit into the piece. And the pieces of music that we were improvised, which don't have a home yet, but which are very interesting with the new pieces of film made. So maybe at the moment we just call them interludes. There's an interlude. It's not part of the main story, but we like the music, we like the images, and we'll find how it shapes the whole piece.
Tell me about collaboration, because you have spent plenty of time in your garden studio doing your work that is kind of iconic to you. But these productions, it brings in musicians, it brings in other people's thoughts and reflections, and it seems like some of that most creative work kind of happens in the ether. It's
not so much in the ether, it's in the studio. It's in the rehearsal studio or in the domestic studio. Here, there are two studios. There's a studio in the garden where we're talking today. And there's a larger studio in the heart of downtown Johannesburg, or in a rough part of downtown, where rehearsals or bigger filmmaking or sculptures would happen. And it's very much there. 7 singers, a pianist, a percussionist, and the composer who's working with the singers, where we'll try a line, and then he'll suggest they'll go away, and they'll come back with 4 different versions. And one of the singers will say, well, I could change it to this point. So it's being found in the moment. And while that's happening, the editor might be with me, or editors might be with me with different projections, just to see what the sound does to the images. It's a very practical making. It's really in the sense of, as much as you can be making film with your hands, it's saying, okay, let's slow this down 20% while they sing the same song. No, keep it as it was, try a different song. Let's see how that changes what you see on the screen. So today, for example, in terms of stupid things in the studio, have a lot of pieces of blue paper, old blueprints, which pinned down and flapped with pieces of cardboard to make them move up and down, and filmed at an angle. And now the hope is that if we split that down the middle and zoom it out as we do it and have another layer below, we can have a sense of the ship making its way through the water. So the first idea of the flapping paper is fine, but then the rest of the day is spent trying to work the grammar of what we've done. How fast does that zoom have to happen? How should we split the page? Straight down the middle or in a zigzag way around the... So it's editors upstairs in the editing suite working on that, and the filming happening downstairs on my table here, but then a movement up and down between filming and looking and refilming and re-looking. So the physical proximity of collaborators is also vital.
So have you ever thought about making a feature-length film?
I have, and I realize that the best films I make are like 9 minutes long, and that if you're doing a feature-length film, you need a psychology of characters, which mine don't really have. I mean, I'd written film scripts, and thank goodness they were never made. They were really not good. I spent a lot of time over the last few years making a series of films about life in the studio called Self-Portrait as a Coffee Pot, 9 half-hour episodes, which are still looking for a home. So it's not as if that form is so obvious to know where they will end up. And they're almost done. We do our final mix in the next couple of weeks. So that's long form, but it's episodic long form. The animation, you can spend a year to make a 7-minute film.
Mm-hmm.
So to make a 70-minute film or a 90-minute film, you're talking about 9 or 10 years. It's not, because for the animation, it doesn't work to have a whole studio. For that, you need to have a script or a storyboard to tell people what to do.
Right.
And the way the films work is without a script or storyboard, from image to image. And that's fine. For 9 minutes, you can ask an audience to make imaginative leaps to construct a kind of narrative. I think if it gets much longer, you need to have more of a structure. So in theater, it's possible for me to think of longer form, an hour and a half, 2 hours. But in animation, not yet.
I feel like some of the best artists leave things unanswered. Can you talk about creating work that asks the viewer to construct meaning rather than receive meaning?
Well, just in the case of these animated films, because they have no script or storyboard, everybody's having to make kind of links. This happened before that, this connects to that. And some people are interested enough. Some people do make a coherence of it, and some people don't. I think that what's interesting for me is how we as humans, as a basic function of how we are in the world, need to make sense of what comes towards us. And you find that when you're having a conversation and you can hardly hear what someone is saying, as a word is missed, your brain prompts, this is what they might have been saying, it could have been, as if they had said that. If you're in a language which we nearly understand but don't completely, when a word comes you don't understand, you make the leap over it. And so what that does is it provokes you from simply a passive reception of things that are clearly understood. You understand every word. There's no effort being done, to when you're really leaning forward, trying to catch it or trying to make sense, when you become more aware of yourself as a constructor of meaning being constructed rather than found, and our complicity in doing that. So you find that with children, when they don't understand a word or they half understand a word, they will, in their brain, recalibrate what the story could be. To recount a story which I've told before, when our daughter Alice was about 2 or 3 years old, I was telling her a story about the doggy chasing the kitty in the garden, and the doggy chased the kitty, and the kitty ran through the cat flap into the kitchen and escaped. And later on, she was recounting to her mother, and she said, what story did William tell you? And she said, well, there was a kitty and there was a doggy, and the doggy chased the kitty, and then the kitty flapped its wings and escaped. So there was a sense of understanding flap, but not understanding cat flap. And so you have to say, well, how does a flap help you to escape if you're a cat chased by a dog and then flapping wings? So that kind of imaginative leap is what we do when we are constructing and when we read a novel. You read a novel set in a town you've never been to. It doesn't mean, oh, well, I don't know what that means. I don't know what that building looks like. I don't know that avenue. You construct from fragments that are already in your head what a possible sense of that place could be, or of character. I mean, all of watching fiction or reading fiction has to do with ourselves as constructors of taking clues and fragments and making an image that doesn't have all the gaps. They say, oh, he was walking past the red fence. You don't see, oh, here's a red fence against nothing. You construct for yourself, whether it's a building or a park or a forest behind the red fence. And I don't think we can resist that. I think it's about our inability not to try to make sense of the world. And that's certainly what art relies on, and the comfort we take from it in understanding our part of it.
The themes that show up time and again in your work, like time, change over time, ambiguity, uncertainty, fate, death, are these conscious choices at this point in your career, or are these things that just continue to bubble up?
I think they're mainly things that continue to emerge in the work. They're questions of, if you're working in animation, if you're working in all film, but if you're working in time, one's very much aware that one is turning the invisibility and abstractness of time into something physical and concrete. The number of frames that you're filming, the 800 grams of a roll of film, which is 4 minutes of time. You turn time into something. You turn it into the smudges on a sheet of paper. So It's not that I'm hunting to say this is the theme I want to explore. It is the theme which is explored, whether one likes it or not in that medium, particularly if it's done slowly in the studio. You expand your 1 minute action into the day of drawing. This afternoon, I'm going to be on the ship. I've got cardboard objects, domestic objects on the table, but I know when we project it, we'll tilt the table they're on, and that what I will animate now is the movement of those objects as they're sliding from one side of the table to the other as the ship moves, as the ship rolls from side to side. And I know that'll take an hour to do, like, what's a 1 second slide across the table, 2 second slide across the table, several times. So I'm very aware of the transformation of time. I think, okay, it needs to slide in 3 seconds. Slower first, then faster. That's 75 frames. So the first ones will be close together because it's slow. Then and I'll quickly mark that on the sheet of paper. So I'll be in my head transposing time into these pencil marks on the sheet of paper, which I know are places to aim for with the object as I animate it. Questions of fate came in the project about the Sibyl. Questions of politics obviously flowed through many of them. The To Believe in Another World, which is a piece about Shostakovich and the Soviet Union and the history of artists under the Soviet Union, and the paradoxes around that. Continued an ongoing interest in that period in history, the art that came out of that period. And so that gave a vocabulary and a language to work with that project. But I'm sure there are other themes that have emerged that are not just the same as that political question in that work.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of place in your work. And it's something that continually comes up with artists that I speak with. I had one guest who had worked alongside Andrew Wyeth for years, and Wyeth would tell him, "Let your roots be your crown." And so my question to you is, how are your roots in South Africa a key component of your work?
Well, firstly, in the most direct sense, that 68 years on, I'm still living in Johannesburg. All the houses and schools I've had are within a few kilometers of each other. The trees that we planted in the house when I was 9 years old are now beautiful, full-grown, large trees. So in that sense, the roots now tower above us, so to speak. But also the history of Johannesburg and the history of my family's history in it have been a vital part in the iconography and the images in the landscapes that are drawn. But more than that, the collaborators I've worked with, musicians, dancers, actors, singers, are very largely from Johannesburg. And so that their histories, their voices, their habits of movement also infect and inflect the work. So that even if there's a piece that we were doing about the Soviet Union, it's very much Soviet Union seen through Johannesburg eyes. And the piece about Marseille and Martinique is that, but it's about how does Frans Fanon and Aimé Césaire still have echoes here in South Africa in 2023. So in that sense, it does feel very, very localized.
Let's talk a little bit more about Oh, to Believe in Another World, the Soviet Union piece. Yeah. Can you talk about how that show explores the myth of utopia?
Well, to give us a quick background, there was an invitation from a Swiss orchestra to make a film to project with the symphony, and I chose the 10th Symphony of Shostakovich. And I chose it both because I love two reasons. Shostakovich, because I love his music, but also it's so cinematic. It's music that you want to see in a way. And that's partly to do with his history of writing music for films. But this is a symphony that was finished and first performed just after the death of Stalin. And we know that Shostakovich had a very complicated relationship with the official Soviet music world and with Stalin, which operas were approved, which ones weren't, when he was in favor, when he was out of favor. And he started writing his music just after the revolution in the 1920s, when there was enormous hope and optimism for this transformed world that was going to be made. And that's also then the poems of someone like Mayakovsky writing in the 1920s and during the time of the revolution. So the texts of Mayakovsky and the music of Shostakovich and some of the visual language of the post-revolutionary era, the constructivists, became the raw material, and we made a 50-minute film using masks, cardboard sets, that explored this question, going from the early days through to Stalin's purges. But obviously what was left at the end is Shostakovich, who outlived Stalin, and his music, which outlives Shostakovich himself. And the pieces at the gallery are both elements of re-editing of some of that film, not into a 50-minute symphony, but into a 12 or 15-minute immersion into 5 different screens, which are surround a viewer, it's almost if one's walking through an old abandoned Soviet museum. The museum made out of cardboard, which is a foot high, and the characters placed inside that using very simple green screen technology, but edited with great skill by the editors in the studio, with some of the texts of Mayakovsky, which were both about optimism, to believe in another world, which is, the pleasure of believing in another world, the utopian thought, and, if only it were possible to believe in another world, but that simple idea of utopia we know is no longer possible. So hopefully all of these things are there in the film, and then there are a number of puppets which were used in the film, and similar puppets which are on exhibition, and then a series of other works connected but not directly connected to the project that make up the exhibition. But the heart of it is this 5-screen projection.
Have you used that green screen before to bring full-size people into these little spaces?
No, this was when working in theater, we always make a cardboard model so we can look at projections, we can think how we would do different scenes, what's the scenic movement. So that's fairly standard. What was different in this case was saying that the scale model, this little cardboard model, will in fact be the sets. They're not a model to be larger scale, 10-meter high theater sets. And so to put people into them, we couldn't film them against the sets, was filming them against the green screen, and you subtract the green and you then place them in whichever. It's never quite that simple, but that's the principle of it. No, but what's happened is that I really loved the green of the green screen. It wasn't a conventional green screen, a different green. And so a lot of the work since then has been done on this green paper, and not to make it invisible, but use its greenness as part of its material. But those drawings aren't on this exhibition.
The sculptures, what does your 3D practice look like? I mean, do you create through sketches and then execute?
The 3D work almost all starts as, well, until now has been starting with black silhouettes. So a torn paper silhouette. Here's a rough shape of a telephone. Here's a rough shape of First World War tank, which looks like a box of Calisson Day, in fact. And then thinking, what would it be? So it's either like a shadow. Here's a small-scale shadow, but we would tear it out of black paper and think, what would it be for that to have a heft? So it's almost extruding that piece of black paper into wax or clay or cloth so that it has a certain weight. And then with some of them, making a lot of small pieces and then choosing a number of those to enlarge, which is a function both of simply copying the small sculpture and making it large, but then a big rearranging in terms of proportion, shape. They become very different as they get larger. And then in a few cases, making more monumental pieces. But there's also been a lot of sculpture which is kind of 2D, 3D, anti-3D sculpture, non-sculpture. So, for example, you have a silhouette of a woman, but you construct it such that the head is a lot in front of where the body is and the legs are 2 meters further behind and the skirt is twisted at an angle. So there's one moment where the different pieces cohere and line up, and you have the coherent image. And as you move around the sculpture, it becomes an incoherent set of fragments. And so in a sense, it's a two-dimensional object. It relies on a monocular vision of putting something together. But having said that, once you know that coherence lies somewhere inside the chaos, the pleasure is in the chaos itself. Saying, this is the sculpture, there's only one moment where it coheres, and for the rest, it doesn't make sense. So there's been a number of sculptures, both small and large, that work on that principle of rotating sculptures which come into focus for a moment and shift out again. Recently, I've started work on some quite bright, vivid sculptures, flattish sculptures, but they're still at the stage of moving from a paper maquette into a medium-sized steel sculpture to a larger scale. And by the end of the year, I'll know if that's of interest or not.
It seems like the sculpture in the show takes on a variety of different weights, right? I mean, there's some that are kind of like an ode to Giacometti, others that it's almost like we can feel your fingerprints in molding clay. And then there are others that are large and solid and have flatter surfaces. And of course, you mentioned the ones that maybe aren't in this show, but utilize a lot of wireframe to accomplish that monocular vision that you mentioned. But it's taken on a lot of different forms. I mean, do you appreciate the variety in that hands-on process?
Yeah, I mean, it's working with different collaborators also. So a lot of the smaller puppet figures like the Giacometti are very much collaborations with the costume designer from the theatre projects, Greta Goris, with whom we'd made puppets for the film, Oh to Believe. So some of those puppets are and then the bronze sculptures are very much working with the foundry in Johannesburg and the master founder there who works with me on those larger sculptures. So they shift. There are a number of different, and then there's one piece which is a bronze horse, which in fact is made out of step ladders and clamps and other pieces of planks. And that relies on the particular skill of one collaborator to paint the bronze to look like wood. So it's a wooden sculpture cast in bronze, painted to look like wood. And until you tap the bronze, you cannot quite credit that it is bronze. So it's a kind of trompe-l'oeil. So it both relates to polychrome sculptures, but also to found materials, to assemblage. So there is, I think, all these three different languages are there. And some of these sculptures then turn into etchings, which will be in another section of the exhibition. The movement from one form, the migration of images from one form to another, whether it's theatre to sculpture to drawing, is something that I'm happy to allow without deciding which is prior, which is primary.
One last question for you, William, and that is, I've been talking to artists and folks that work on catalog raisonnés, talking to people that deal with artists' estates, and something that's been coming up a lot recently is an artist's legacy. And, at this point in your life, what do you hope your legacy will be?
I was with a very nice South African poet, and she was asked the same question. A whole lot of people being given awards were asked what their legacy was. And a lot of them said, if I can show younger children how they can get on in the world, that's the legacy I would love, or people to enjoy my songs 50 years from this. And this poet's answer was said, legacy? What I would like to leave is a big scandal. Not quite sure I have her courage to say that, but I've no idea. At the moment, I put that off by working on the next thing.
The legacy of your parents is very interesting. For folks that don't know the legacy of your father, Sidney, and the groundbreaking work your mother, Felicia, did, maybe you could talk a little bit about the legacy that they left behind in their careers.
Well, yeah, I mean, my father was an advocate and my mother too, a lawyer, trial lawyer. And he did a lot of very important political cases in South Africa during the apartheid years and during the struggle against apartheid. And I think that's had a big impact apart from the impact obviously on me and on his other children and their other children, but that's had a big impact on how law is practiced and understood in South Africa. And my mother founded the first sort of public interest law firm, which took on a lot of unpopular cases in its and it still runs in South Africa. And so in her way also was vital in shaping how the law was seen in South Africa. And I'm sure that obviously changed how I saw the world as a child, coming from a very liberal family in the very illiberal South African circumstance. No, to be serious, I'm happy that my work has had an effect on some artists. and change the way that other people have seen what happens here and understood how the world could operate in South Africa and elsewhere. But legacy longer than that, I wouldn't like to speculate.
Well, your father is 100, so our conversation about legacy is probably 32 years premature.
Well, yes, he's led a much more sober and Spartan life than I have, so I cannot quite have expectations of his longevity, but I'm very happy for his.
William, I can't say thank you enough for your time today and the conversation about your work. It's been a real honor to get to spend time with you, trying to dive a little bit into what's inside your head. And thank you so much for your time today.
Well, Craig, thank you.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.